Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to my Final Fantasy XIV Retro Revisit, Retrospective, whatever you want to call it. Today we're continuing with our Heavensward Retrospective as we look back on patch 3.3, the roughly middle point of pretty much any expansion, although it's a little bit beyond that, as I'm sure many of you are aware by now. I've already talked about the kind of doom and gloom that I felt early Heavensward inflicted on its player base, and 3.3, while not being titled Gears of Change like the previous patch, is where I started to feel that change and the winds that would eventually lead us into Stormblood, which I'm going to have a lot of fun things to say about when we get there. So without further ado, let's dive into the 3.3 content, and I'll tell you how I best remember it and the number of things that 3.3 brought that is pretty interesting looking back and seeing what was there. So first, MSQ related stuff. I gotta bring this up every video, but this one was really good. This was the finale of the Dragon Song War, and it's important to note that this is the first time we got a mid-expansion end of the story. A Realm Reborn was really just a lot of foundation building and going through the motions and laying a lot of seeds for later, things that even they didn't know how they were going to use in the future. But in patch 3.3, we had a real finale. 3.0 ended and we clearly knew there were some loose ends, and we now had a better idea of what to expect from the expansions going forward. And this would become the norm for the next several expansions up until where we are now, where it's no longer the norm again. Very curious to see if they go back to this trend in 7.0 and 7.3 ends up being our real sort of finale here. But it also came with something else that was really exciting. Not only did we have this amazing cinematic finale of the Dragon Song War, but there were even follow-up quests to give us a little bit more insight as to how the characters were really handling everything after all was done. And this is something that's really welcome, and again, something they have gone back to time and time again in the other expansions as well, with varying results, but some of the most heartfelt quests have been from this sort of victory lap, so much so that they've even incorporated some of them into the MSQ itself, instead of making it this thing that you could potentially miss. So on this note alone, 3.3 gave us a ton when it came to even just the little things about how they would manage the game in the future from their MSQ, on top of what was a really satisfying end to this particular chapter in Final Fantasy XIV. Now, with the MSQ, I feel like it's fair enough in this case to go immediately into the trial in that of Mhach, the final Steps of Faith. Weird to have Steps of Faith in 2.5 and then to do final steps here. It's definitely made talking about it a little confusing, but the trial is against Mhach itself, and to this day, I still think this is one of the best trials they've ever released, and it's got a lot to go up against. Not the best, I know what some of you are thinking, but one of the best. It's got a ton of great cinematic changes, things that I feel like would influence a certain particular content in 6.1, where you have this sort of introduction, the music's a little bit slower, it's somber, and as you start to build up hope and things start to accelerate, the music changes, and then when all hell breaks loose, you get the final theme, you get the real theme for the final phase, and everything just comes to a crescendo. It's incredibly exciting, worthy of being a final boss to a 1,000-year war, and just mechanically is very good. I do think it's a small step down from Sephiroth from the patch prior, but so small that it's insignificant. One of the toughest ad phases that there was at the time, and that's again after Sephiroth, which was a really big struggle for a lot of people with all the explosions. Just the sheer mechanics, the movement, it was something, again, that really actually felt like a new age was coming in Final Fantasy XIV. Maybe that was because it was the end of the story that we'd wondered about since 1.0, but even just mechanically, cinematically, it was on a whole nother level for the time. And speaking of Sephiroth, I've got a lot of segues with this one. They did something here that I wish they would do with more quests in Final Fantasy XIV. Something they do with trials, but something I wish they do more of overall. They had a specific quest for the Warring Triad here. Because there was no actual trial as part of the Warring Triad quest, they instead filled the void by continuing the story with something a little bit in between. And this is something that I love when they do it. They've done it in so few places, but when they do, it is so incredibly worth it. I can definitely start naming them, but we'll get to those in future retro videos as well. One thing I've always wanted is this style quest between raid releases, between 8-man raid releases, between 24-man raid releases, and again, There is kind of that, but we'll get to that when we have some of our retrospectives way in the future. Just wanted to shout this particular quest out, though, because I think it is a shining example of doing a little thing and it going a long way. Then we have the dungeons, two pretty good dungeons. So the first one would be Hullbreaker Hard Mode. You know, we always get the one hard mode and then the one brand new dungeon. Hullbreaker Hard Mode to me isn't as memorable as the original. I think the original did a lot for this kind of open, exciting landscape. Yes, it has the caves, but now it's really more of a fun little battleground, this training area that we get to use. And while it does give us an important answer and some insight into a particular character by the end of it, it definitely didn't feel as regal and natural as the original one did. Not to mention, I don't think any of the bosses are as iconic, though the final boss definitely posed a lot of trouble for people at the time. The other dungeon, on the other hand, Sorkai, was by far one of the better dungeons we had had at that point. While it did have a lot of the traditional gameplay elements, they snuck a few little things in there that players came to appreciate, even if they were mildly annoying. Killing a certain enemy first would allow you to get a haste buff from it, even if it threw you into the air in the process. There were enemies that were asleep, and you could abuse that to kill them one at a time, which was great for groups that maybe didn't have as much gear or weren't as committed to super big speedrun pulls as some of the other players were, myself included. But on top of that, the bosses were also just pretty good. The only thing that kind of triggers me a little bit is the second boss, which was kind of like King Mogglmog Light. Definitely the place I experienced the most wipes on patch, but the final boss too has all these platform breaks and the ability to fall off and these ads flying all over the place. Absolute chaos. Now I have to use past tense because I'm going to break the fact that we're talking about 3.3 for a second to point out that this version of Sorkai no longer exists. The current form has been reformed to be far more traditional. And while I do appreciate some aspects of it for kind of making another thing that happened in 6.1 a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more recognizable, I felt like we lost a lot of uniqueness when it came to the original Sorkai. As frustrating as it may have been for a new player, this one will always hold a place in. And if that one holds a place in my heart, then the next thing probably dug another hole in it, because we have the follow-up to the Shadows of Mhach raid series with what was at the time one of the most iconic 24-man raids, something that still brings fear into the heart of people when it pops up in the roulette. I still see people leave just on memory alone, in that of the Weeping City of Mhach. This was one of those, man, I sure hope we don't disband. I sure hope we can actually clear it before the lockout finishes. And every single time you queued in, it was a question mark. Now, the trash in the first couple of bosses, not so bad. The first boss definitely had a few headaches. There's a lot of orbs that need to be intercepted, and sometimes people just wouldn't take responsibility. But once the community had standardized, alliances doing certain things, it definitely sped up a little bit. The second boss to this day still kills people because you have to get zombified sometimes in order. You have to get like a partial zombie debuff to avoid dying instantly, but there's these debuffs that kind of just pop up at the last second, and sometimes people stack them up, and it can be really difficult to only get hit by one. So there's a lot of stuff that's not immediately obvious to the player. There's nothing in the game prior to educate how you would do this boss, so you will die probably the first time you do it. I think that's fine, but to this day, there's still new people experiencing it, which means you still have some hilarity. I'm sure I'm going to get to do a Duty Finder disaster on that at some point. The third boss, however, is really where things kicked off, in that of Ozma, the super boss from Final Fantasy IX, that to this day is still one of the scariest globes anyone will ever see. This is so iconic that the developer who made it is often known as Mr. Ozma in the community. Yeah, for a 24-man boss to get that as part of your reputation, I think that speaks a lot. Percentage damage, knockbacks, the ability to fall off, these very cinematic phase changes that all have some sort of instant ability, different abilities for each of them, ads that need to be dropped separate but then killed quick, and most of the time people don't separate them enough, and it's a disaster. It didn't matter how many markers you had or put down or how much you talked to people. Sometimes people just panicked. That was all there was to it. Body language is strong. That's all I'll say. And the final boss was no slouch either. If anything, what actually ended up happening there, fun memory, Califasteri has an ability where she cuts half of the room and she transforms one of her hair strands to do it. Now, in some parts of the fight, you can actually, as the tank, turn the boss and just face it away from the raid entirely, instead of making them kind of take that little step to the right or the left, whatever. However, there are some spots where you can't. And so people would sometimes get used to the tanks doing that and then forget they couldn't do it for some parts. And then there would be other times where the tanks turn her the wrong way and cleave everybody. And then there's sometimes where the tanks just don't turn and the party just thinks the tank is going to turn. So it created this weird, like, sort of pause for a lot of people who didn't really know what type of tank to expect and thus often would just kind of debate themselves into dying. And I'm sure that still happens to this day. But man, yeah, that raid is just full of memories. And even after a lot of nerfs, you can blast through a lot of this stuff now with gear and balance changes that have happened over the years. But again, people remember, and that does influence how it actually goes. But yeah, it's easier, but you can don't be surprised if you wipe to that in the duty finder still. Now, some other major pieces of content. We got a new frontline map in this patch, Shatter. Now, it's not one of my favorite maps, has actually recently been reworked, but you know, it was nice to get something new. I actually think that in terms of PvP additions, Heavensward was overall pretty healthy for the game. We got Seize back in an earlier retro in 3.05, and then Shatter here, which was a nice change of pace. I mean, nowadays, we don't really expect new large-scale maps. They don't really commit to it because they don't seem to have the popularity that, well, I guess they would wish they would have. While we do get a ton of crystalline conflict maps, you know, getting these new large-scale maps was definitely something we appreciated. It made it feel like they were really trying between the feasts, this, and Seize. We were eating good at the time. It features all the usual stuff. It has Adrenaline Rush for the personal PvP. I don't remember if Adrenaline Rush was new at this point. I think Adrenaline Rush was in Seize, but I'd have to double check. Battle High and Fever, same deal. Probably the funniest thing about the PvP updates is that in the Fold, which I can't believe was still around by this point, the original PvP mode, and the Feast, they didn't have a clear means of letting you know you won or lost. You just had to like realize it or know based on the score. So they added the text on the screen that says win or lose in that patch. To think that that is an addition in 3.3, like over 3 years after the release of A Realm Reborn, is crazy. But sometimes the small quality of life things you think were probably always there, you really do learn with 14, especially through the series, that sometimes they just weren't. Another really exciting thing that would change the landscape of treasure hunting for the rest of the game, and still does to this day, our first treasure dungeon, the Aquapolis, or the Aquapolis, if you prefer. I don't like the way that sounds. Basically, when doing the 8-player design treasure maps that have the number 8 on them, there was a chance that you could open a portal to a brand new dungeon. And while you're going through it, you just slay all the enemies. There's some random occurrences that can drop more materia or gil or items. And then you also get these little mini games in between. They've added to it since, but basically the idea is you get loot, you try to open a door, and then you maybe get to the next floor, maybe don't. And your goal is to try to RNG your way to the end to get tons and tons of loot. I haven't done one of these in quite some time, but treasure dungeons are one of my favorite additions to the game. Going out into the world with a group of players with the goal of just making money. It gets players out and exploring. And honestly, one of those things that when you're a new player, it's kind of nice to see people going around and doing these things in the open world. It was a bit more influential during Heavensward because, you know, a player could get to 50 and then once they're going through Heavensward, they might start seeing people doing this open world content. And that's something that people often complain about with 14 to this day, is it never feels like the world is alive a lot of the times. And when there weren't as many zones, this definitely filled that void. Not to mention, it was just a lot of fun. You know, you'd have the one friend who'd get super lucky and get their portal all the way to the end of the dungeon, and you'd get the people who would go like 7, maps without getting a portal. So you got to laugh a little bit at RNG, cry a little bit at RNG, but it was a fun time. And it's something that has become a standard in content updates in Final Fantasy XIV since then. So we got to thank the OG here with the Aquapolis. We also had some of the other like little side quest additions in here. Scholastica got a follow-up. I almost forgot to mention it in 3.2. I had to go back and I think edit it in that same night because I had finished rendering it and I re-recorded it. Hildebrand, of course, getting a follow-up. The Anima Weapons getting a follow-up. This step I remember in particular. This was the Crystal Sand step. You had to collect crystal sand and umbrites. And while it's not like a good step, I think more people enjoyed the step before that required light. The crystal sand step had this really interesting interaction. There were a lot of ways to get crystal sand. And one way that was discovered was you could actually use leave quests and open sometimes there's a random chest in a leave quest, and that could have an amber encased vialkin. Now in Heavensward, you could use amber encased vialkins to purchase items, and in fact, in this patch, they nerfed the amount of amber encased vialkins you needed for a bunch of like crafted gear equivalents, just for stuff while you were leveling up. But you could also trade them for crystal sands. So I remember making a video about how, you know, you could make, if you were lucky, upwards of 20 of, I think, the 80 crystal sands that you needed in just an hour. But sometimes you'd get like 9 or 15 or 2, like it was all RNG. And I'm sure if I go back through that video, there's probably still a bunch of comments that say, this doesn't work anymore. It still works. They've never changed it. Your luck is bad. That's really unfortunate. But trust me, it still does work if you're doing your animal weapon quest and you happen to have 100 leave quests lying around. So that's just one particularly special memory for me. One also special memory is the new tribal quest additions in 3.3. The Moogles. This one wasn't a favorite. People didn't like the Moogles in Heavensward. I don't know that I mentioned it that much in the previous retros, but they had a ton of really annoying quests and side quests throughout the Churning Mist section of the story, and a fair portion of them were required to unlock these Moogles, who were, I believe, both crafting and gathering beast tribes. I think you could take either route in this particular case. And these quests, they weren't worse, but people weren't exactly thrilled about it. They were tribal quests. However, this does mark an important point. These were not the first, but they were how do I want to put this? So the Ixal existed in A Realm Reborn. They were, crafting, gathering beast tribe. These were that, but they were like specifically designed as like a means of leveling from the 50 to 60 range. Whereas the Ixal quest, you could start, I think, as early as 15. So they had this kind of like weird power void depending on what level you were while you were doing them. Whereas this was a far more streamlined experience for it, I think is what I want to say. So I don't love them, but I did use them to level. So I guess I can't complain on that front. Not to mention, I remember the rewards from the Moogle, specifically the currency you get from doing the dailies, which has been true this, you've been getting that this entire time. I remember it being very valuable from a crafted material that you could get. I think it was glass fiber or something along those lines. And I remember making millions of gil off of the Moogles just from selling that one item. So another good memory from them. They even added some stuff to the previous Heavensward tribal quest here. They added like a Vanu suit and a Nath suit in this patch as well. So yeah, I mean, overall, tribal quest updates were good. Just Moogles. And then everything else here is really just quality of life. I mean, obviously there were job adjustments. So speaking of job adjustments on the patch, Bard, Summoner, Astro, and Ninja all got buffs. Ninja shocked people, but it was really just AoE buffs. And then Astro continued to get usability buffs. Summoner got some potency buffs, and Bard got a ton of potency buffs. Now, this was a precursor because in the following patches, Bard would power spike very, very hard. And part of it came from the updates that they got in 3.3, then being compounded with the item level increase in 3.4. Don't worry, we will talk about that in the 3.4 retro. Oh, this is not a minor feature at all. The Raid Finder was added in 3.3. Now, in NA, you might not know what the Raid Finder is because almost nobody uses it other than to queue in once they've made a party in the Party Finder. But the Raid Finder was essentially the Duty Finder for raids. Pretty simple. Now, it became a staple over in Japan, and from what I understand, even a little bit in Europe, where essentially players go into the Raid Finder, when they're looking to do their re-clears or they're trying to find, a kill party or something like that. And it's very standardized, it's very professional, it's very effective. However, in NA, again, it's pretty much just used to queue in, and almost nobody goes in completely like on their own with that. It's really unfortunate because the cultures and servers in the world that have just made use of it have way better clear rates than North America. And I'm not saying that's because they use the Raid Finder, but I'm saying that because the use of it has been standardized, it's much less intimidating getting into and getting the initial clear for your raids and getting the re-clears. Like that's just, imagine just queuing into the Raid Finder, not sitting there wondering if a Party Finder is going to fill or when's a tank going to join, or maybe you should gear something else to fill the spots that are more blah, blah, blah. No. Just literally queue into the Raid Finder and put duty complete, and you're entering a re-clear party. It works so well. And I have a ton of little things. The Heat of Battle 3 action was added to the Grand Companies. I think at this point, prior to this, it was exclusive to the wheel, the magic wheel, the ethereal wheel. So you had to make it as an action within an FC house. But at this point, it was added to the Grand Company, the 15% EXP. Flower pots were added, which I've never quite been interested in as a non-housing user, but this was the patch that introduced flower pots, so you could, you know, not garden, but garden for like glam, since that's all it is. It's just like you're making flowers that, you know, will, you know, spruce up your house, make it look nicer. Housing wards, they added, I think, subdivisions 9 through 12. Yeah, subdivisions 9 through 12 were added, so a big infusion of new houses. I'm sure they thought that would be the end of it. No, it's never over. There will never be enough houses. They started, you know, making more mounts able to fly again. That's something they had to do for quite some time. Fenrir, I know, is the one for this patch. They also had, speaking of flying, airship landing being added to the Ethernet list when you completed getting all the other Ethernets in a city state. Yeah, that wasn't a thing up till now, but after that, it became it. Ether currents were adjusted. Now, this is interesting, and this we'll talk about a little bit more in the 4.0 retro, but the ether currents were in really obnoxious places when Heavensward launched. I think they even might have made some adjustments to them before this point. I don't remember the previous videos because, you know, I can't remember everything. But yeah, this was a big one. They basically put all of the ether currents in Heavensward along the MSQ, which would make some decisions they made in later expansions very weird. Don't know why they did that. Also, bonus info and duty information. So now it would actually show you like micro objectives in the duty information. You know, when you queue in and it just says, you know, you have this much time left in the instance. Now it would have things that were either pertinent to fights, like, you know, gauges that the boss would have, or even just like telling you what your general objective was at the moment. Sometimes it just felt like flavored text, but either way, it was nice to have. Another fun one, crafted final coil gear. So you could get crafted dreadworm. I think I mentioned crafted second coil gear in a previous one, which was great for making Gil, but now they had crafted dreadworm gear as well, which you'd have to go back to the final coil and get the items for in order to make it, which was, again, another nice infusion of Gil for anyone who just didn't want it and wanted to sell to the people who wanted to glam. They also kept making more crafting adjustments, another very noticeable patch of them trying to make specialization a little bit more accessible. They removed some of the things that used to be on specialization, kind of outdated at that point, but they also made a lot of other little changes that I'm not going to get into, but they were, again, still trying to fine-tune the specialization thing during Heavensward. Ooh, okay, so we've got some pretty interesting quality of life here. Some interesting, some not so. The optimized gear button was added in patch 3.3. So up to this point, you know, you had to manually make sure that all of your gear was updated by going into the armory chest and equipping it. Now, as long as it was an item level upgrade, you could just click optimized gear, and at the very least, everything would get brought up to the max item level. Really useful for leveling, something that I'm sure all of us use to this day, and it wasn't in the game until patch 3.3. They also added mentor statuses. So when mentor system was initially introduced, there was only one type of mentor, but now they had subdivisions for it. This was when they added PvE status, crafter status, stuff like that. Great, but you know how I feel. Anyway, waymarks showing on the minimap, that was added in this patch. You could just only see them on the ground prior to that. Now you could also see them on the minimap, something I definitely use a lot. Oh my goodness. The partial match feature on the market board was added in 3.3. So before 3.3, if you wanted to search something on the market board, you had to make sure you typed it pretty exactly, because it couldn't partially take in whatever you typed and find just everything with that. So yeah, in 3.3, they added that. And I don't know about you, I don't even understand why it's an option. I mean, I kind of do, like, if you want to put in the exact item, then yeah, but then I just put in the exact item. Yeah, no, partial matching was like, that is permanently on for me, and it has been since 3.3, so thank goodness for that. Even something little as being able to customize the party list according to job. So that was added to the role settings in 3.3, so you can actually prioritize the different jobs on top of prioritizing the order the roles would actually display. Not something I've used very much, but is a very useful feature. And then, you know, another really small thing, Alliance members being out of range. Up to this point, you couldn't tell unless the game just wouldn't let you click them. Now their names would actually be grayed out, so you wouldn't have to question if they were in range or out of range. Like, it's, again, every time I do one of these videos, I'm shocked at how many of these little things were not standard. Like, I know these things were added to the game. Like, I remember that. But revisiting the idea of living before those times by going through this series, mind-blowing to me. So yeah, and I'm sure there's a ton of other little things like PvP adjustments, again, like little like quality of life, like new poses for idling and group pose features and stuff. They were always updating those things. But I felt like a lot of these were things that are more noticeable now and like are in front of more players. So again, if there's something else that I missed, feel free to put it in the comment section below. And you know what? You might recognize this shirt from when I interrupted myself in the 3.2 video, and that's because I forgot to include 3.25 stuff. So maybe I should quickly glance at 3.35 before I end this video. And it's a good thing I did, because one of the most important you know what? I would have watched the trailer and realized it right afterwards. Palace of the Dead was put in patch 3.35, our very first deep dungeon. Now, for those who haven't done it, deep dungeon is essentially a dungeon where you start at level 1 and you have to level up and carry yourself all the way through as you gain your new abilities, defeat enemies, avoid traps on the ground, defeat bosses, and every 10 floors you get a save point. Palace of the Dead was very popular upon its introduction. It was great for leveling. It was a brand new dungeon type experience, and it has been a system that they have built on and added new things for, not constantly, but it's been a staple of the Final Fantasy XIV community. This is when they added the first 50 floors to Palace of the Dead, and don't worry, we'll have plenty to say about Palace of the Dead in the future, but I'm going to leave that for those pertinent patches for when certain things are added. On top of that, even just the simple ability to do /doze on like a bed and then do a different animation, even that was added in 3.35. Like that little thing was just stuck in there, just flicked in real quick in the 3.35 update. They made a bunch of changes to the feast along with Season 2. They made some adjustments to Shatter as well, which made sense. They adjusted drop rates to some. So I think, no, this wasn't the first drop rate. They actually, you know, really weird. They actually adjusted the drop rates for Ravana, Bismarck, and Thornton all in 3.35. And made them purchasable with 99 tomes. Weird that they did them all at once, but I guess that is, I think, what they did with the A Realm Reborn one. So maybe they just thought to do like Garuda, Ifrit, and Titan, they do it the same way. But yeah, I mean, the big thing here is definitely Palace. Man, imagine if I had forgotten to check before releasing this video. Thank goodness the trailer would have definitely saved me from forgetting to include it overall. But that is a major feature to have almost missed. So dodge that bullet on that one. But I think that ends up being all of it, other than like, you know, bugs and stuff that I remember. But, you know, I'm not going to dig through every single thing for that. Anyway, that is going to be a wrap for my patch 3.3 retro video. As you can tell, I'm a lot more positive about what hit in this patch. We had content that was good for casual players with Palace of the Dead, these story follow-ups, and another approachable animal weapon step, another way for people to level crafters with the tribes, the Aquapolis. So much content that appealed to a lot of different people, not just casual people, but they could access it super easily. And then a decent trial, some decent dungeons, good MSQ. The only people who were hurting were hardcore raiders, and at that point a lot of people were still struggling with Midas anyway, so that didn't even end up mattering all that much. Everyone was just glad to have all these different reasons to play, and that's why I think this was the real turning point for Heavensward, not the patch prior that tried to put it in the title name. No, 3.3. And the good news is it goes up from here, so I'm looking forward to talking about 3.4 as well. Anyway, that's going to be a wrap. Hopefully you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, I bid you adieu.